Включаю запись. Все. Звук есть?
Вот телевизор баттер себе. Может, тебе?
Okay, good evening, everybody. My name is Joe Durkin, and it's a pleasure to be here with you this evening for the legal segment of the broker course. If you wouldn't mind just confirming that I'm coming through loud and clear, just on a quick sound check. There's a text box there that you can use maybe to just so that you can hear me clearly. Sounds good. Thanks, Yigal. Excellent. Thanks, Sanjay, Johanna. So, a couple of things just before we start. There's a small group of us. I think there's 11 of us here today. And feel free as we go along to unmute yourself and ask questions. And that makes it a lot more interactive and easier for everybody else. Quite often when we get a lecture online as opposed to in person, where people do ask questions and participate, it's less of just me talking. It makes it a little bit easier to digest the information. So if you're feeling brave, ask questions as we go along, and that will be for everybody's benefit. Just a quick introduction to me. My name is Joe Durkin. I'm a lawyer. I've been based in Dubai for 15 years, and I've been teaching this course for almost 10 years with the Land Department, and I've practiced a lot of law that relates to real estate disputes in Dubai. So a lot of the stuff that we're going to go through is quite familiar to me. One of the other things I suppose to notice that we'll take 1 or 2 breaks. We'll take our first break in about an hour's time, a little after 5 o'clock, maybe 5:15. We'll see how we go, and then we'll take a shorter break before we try and finish up at around maybe 7:15, 7:30, or even a little bit earlier if we get through it pretty fast. So to start off, one last point to make is that when it comes to exam questions, the exam questions are randomly chosen, but they come from the material that we're going to look at. So any of these slides could potentially have an exam question coming from it. So what we've tried to do is be quite economical with the material, not to give you too much extra stuff that you may not necessarily need. Any of the points that I make that isn't necessarily on a slide is really me just trying to make a point or maybe help you understand it, because you understand it, hopefully you learn it easier. So, you don't need to scribble down loads of notes as we go along if you're thinking about how to pass the exam, for example. So to start off, why are we here today? Well, the first thing is that point number 3, there's a requirement for real estate brokers to pass an examination, and to do so, you're going to be asked questions that come out of these slides. So there's a regulatory requirement for anybody who wants to make money as a real estate broker in Dubai to be licensed, and that means attending this course and passing an exam. So unfortunately, we have to be here, I suppose, But the other thing really is that the purpose is to make sure that brokers as professionals have all of the requisite knowledge that relate to real estate in Dubai, because in short, that is good for Dubai, it's good for the market, it's good for the economy to have this level of professionalism in play. And the only way you're going to have that is by having really, educated and up to speed with the regulations brokers. And that's what the purpose of this course is to do. But I suppose second thing to note is that, from a practical perspective, a lot of the material that we will go through, today's course is the legal course, okay? So you might think, well, is this not really for the lawyers to be advising on? And the answer to that is, well, not really, because what tends to happen is that, questions of a legal nature are quite often put to brokers as opposed to lawyers. So if I was to ask you a question, and I suppose I'll ask this question to you, and please, unmute yourself and answer over the voice, but otherwise feel free to use the chat box as well. And the question is, what percentage of real estate transactions, buying or selling, let's say, have lawyers advising the buyer or seller? What would you guess? What percentage of real estate transactions in Dubai would have lawyers being instructed by the buyer or the seller? Any guesses, guys? Anybody want to? Okay, we've got a few coming in. Sandeep says less than 10 to 15%. And that's a pretty good guess, Sandeep. Anybody else want to? Yigal thinks maybe 30%, and Sanjay thinks maybe 5%. Okay, so I would say that, and Rahul 5 to 10%. So Sandeep, Sanjay, Rahul, I think you're pretty close to being on the mark for this. I would say roughly 5% as well. Now, it's not that this is necessarily tracked in a database, but from my own experience, I've been here for 15 years, it is very rarely the case that, and 5% is 1 in 20, which would be rare. It's fairly rarely the case that for even buying and selling real estate, lawyers get instructed. Now, I don't know which countries all you guys are from or where you might have practiced real estate before. But if I was to ask a question in your home country, like if you're from India or if you're from the UK, maybe the US, maybe a European country, wherever, could anybody tell us in their home country, if somebody's going to go and buy property, often considered to be the most significant transaction most normal people will ever enter into, what percentage of people will engage lawyers? Any ideas in your home country? What percentage of transactions? So I'm not too sure where you're from, Sandeep, but maybe if you could mention the country and where you think it's less than 5%. In India, okay. The statistics in a lot of the countries that I'm familiar with, like in the UK or continental Europe or the US, it's nearly 100% of transactions will have lawyers involved. So in the UK, for example, lawyers perform a role of escrow agent where they take into their lawyer's account the proceeds that has been used to purchase the property, and they would perform that type of a function. So in many parts of the world, it's almost 100% of transactions will have lawyers involved. So the next obvious, I suppose, observation is that if most people, 95%, are not speaking to lawyers or engaging lawyers to write the contracts, who is writing these contracts? Who is advising them on every question that they have when they're buying property? In short, the answer is it's you guys, it's brokers, okay? So what that really means is that hopefully some of the stuff that we talked through today is relevant. And, you know, sometimes people will go, well, I don't see myself, for example, as being all that interested in advising on landlord-tenant law, okay? Like if you're a broker, you might go, look, I'm going to carve out a niche that I'm going to become a specialist in a particular neighborhood and try and act for buyers or sellers in that neighborhood. So why would I need to know too much about landlord-tenant? And the answer to that is because quite often, you know, the most significant questions that buyers have are questions relating to landlord-tenant law. So, for example, if I buy this property, I've been told by the seller that he has served an eviction notice on the tenant, and that that notice date requires him to leave on the 1st of June in 6 months' time. Am I okay to go and buy that property and there won't be a problem when that tenant is about to leave? That's a landlord-tenant question. And if you're a broker acting for a buyer and you're not able to navigate an answer to that very, very difficult question, in fact, because it's not a very straight answer, well then, you know, you might have a problem because you might not be able to convince him to, you know, purchase the property, or you may not feel that you're up to the level of professionalism to give him the comfort that he needs, okay? So what I suppose what I'm getting at is that having the general knowledge of all of the points we go through today is hopefully something that's going to be beneficial beyond just, you know, ticking a box of a requirement for you to attend and pass the exam. So hopefully you get a little bit more out of it too. So I suppose, you know, final point really is it's to make sure that Dubai maintains its reputation as an excellent place to do business. You know, again, another little question for you. You know, Dubai is obviously a place that has many different nationalities, and that is reflected in the statistics of where purchasers for real estate come from. If I was to ask you, could anybody guess, you know, what are the top 5 nationalities in Dubai that are purchasing property in the last year or two? What would you guess the top 5 nationalities would be? Again, feel free to use your microphone, or if you prefer, use the chat box. India, Russia, yeah, significant Indian, Russian, English are always in there. True. Chinese have been mentioned. Britain, India, Russia. Looking at your answers. Yeah. So last year, I mean, it's been sort of interesting because we've seen a lot of increased investment from France as well, and from Italy that were not as prevalent in the past. India has always been top 2 or 3 for the 15 years that I've been here. Pakistan is obviously well reflected, as are many of the other Arabic nearby nations. And then you've had a lot of Russian investment recently as well. So just worth noting, I suppose, that you've got, you know, nationalities or purchasers, investors coming from countries that have very different languages, very different customs of business practice, and very different legal systems. And they will be coming to you with their own idea, perhaps from their home country, of how it is to do a deal in Russia, or how it is to do a deal in China or in the UK. And none of that may be all that necessarily beneficial when it comes to how you do a deal in Dubai, because it has its own laws and regulations. So just to be aware of the, you know, cultural issues at play here, that, you know, sometimes people will think, well, this is how, you know, we would execute a real estate transaction in the UK. Well, you know, that may not necessarily be the case, obviously, in Dubai. So to be bearing that in mind is useful. The other thing, I suppose, just to note is, on many of the slides, we would refer to law numbers and law years. Nobody is ever expecting you to remember a law number. You know, it's just not required, okay? It's just really the concepts that we're looking at. So all of you guys are going to be working for companies that are real estate brokerages who have licenses which are issued by the all of you guys are required to have a broker card in the first place, attend this course, as we said, and ultimately you will work for companies which are ones which are licensed by the DED, Dubai Economic Department. When you obtain your broker card, that lasts for 1 year, and you're required to renew it 30 days prior to its expiration. So you come down to the Land Department 30 days before the end of it. So we're going to move on, and we're going to talk about fairly quickly, I suppose, the following. The Code of Ethics, okay? So agency contracts between brokers and clients must be in writing as a precondition to the broker being eligible to be paid his fee, okay? That seems to be pretty straightforward, have everything in writing. All brokers are required to comply with the Code of Ethics. A broker may not enter into a transaction that violates laws and regulations. As you would expect, all transactions made by a broker must be recorded and documents furnished to contracting parties when requested. So, in short, the same as with many professions, you are required to provide to your client any documents that relate to a transaction when they seek them from you. So if you go to your doctor, you must give your patient form. The doctor must give his patient form. With your lawyers, the lawyer must hand over all of the various case notes that relate to your case. So the same is true when you go to a broker. There's a requirement to provide all of the relevant documents. A broker must furnish clients with all details of negotiations and substantial issues that relate to the subject of a transaction. So this is simply put, you have to keep your client up to speed and fully informed of everything that is happening in relation to a transaction as it arises, okay? So you have to be transparent. That's pretty straightforward. You're being professional, the same as you go to a lawyer. He doesn't just tell you at the end of your case that you've won or you've lost. He's with you, holding your hand throughout the process. A broker must make all offers in good or a buyer or a seller in a transaction. You usually act for one side or the other, okay? Some rare occasions you might be fortunate to find yourself acting for both. But if you were acting, for example, the seller of property, and you became aware that there was something wrong with that property, or that it wasn't eligible to be sold, perhaps because it wasn't registered with the Land Department or something of that nature. And if the buyer came with his own broker, so you acting for the seller, you don't have a contract with the buyer has his own broker. If you, thought that, well, surely there's no problem here because it's up to the buyer's broker to tell him if any issues in relating to the transaction, that wouldn't be good enough, because the requirement of good faith applies to regardless of who you represent. So if acting for the seller, you were aware there's a problem with the property and that it is not legitimate to be sold, well, then you can't proceed with that transaction. A broker is the guardian of monies given to him and should do so as instructed by a client. So you are in a position of great importance. Sometimes you're holding post-dated checks, for example, 10% of the value of the property from the buyer and from the seller. And if one party, for example, pulls out of the deal without good contractual cause, well, then you would hand over the non-defaulting parties. You hand over the defaulting party's check to the non-defaulting party. In that type of an arrangement, you can see that there's potentially huge risk in play. So you are guardian of those checks, and you have to follow clear instructions as set out in the agreement that has been reached between the buyer and the seller. A broker must compensate a party that incurs a loss as a result of the broker's deception, misrepresentation, or negligence. Okay, so that simply means that if you've been deceitful or misrepresenting certain things, well, then you could be pursued for that, obviously. And misrepresenting a form of lying, again, it's something of that nature. Again, you could be sued. So that is sort of a summary of the Code of Ethics. Now, I'll just give you a moment or two to look over the slides, and if there's any specific questions, I'll give you, a little under a minute. Please come back to me and let me know. Just have a look at that.
Hi, Joseph. I have one question.
Is that Yigal, is it?
Yes, it is.
Yes, please.
I would like to know, can I represent as a broker? Can I represent, because I have also my apartments, my properties in Dubai. Can I represent myself as a broker as the seller? I mean, selling my own property?
The answer is yeah, you can represent yourself as the seller. So the third point from the bottom, it says a broker should not represent himself as the buyer in the transaction, okay? And what this is really getting at is it doesn't mean that you can't, if you're a broker, act for yourself being a buyer. It is saying that you should not pretend deceitfully to a seller that you're the buyer when you're actually a broker. Because in the past, there was sort of, some sharp practice where, somebody might advertise a property and say, that they're looking for a customer directly, and then, buyer's brokers would approach a seller's broker and say, let's split the commission 50-50. So that third point from the bottom is to cover off, you should not misrepresent yourself as being a buyer if you're not a buyer. In the case where you are a seller, you're entitled to represent, and you're entitled to do so.
Well, thanks.
Does that make sense, Yigal?
Yeah. So, thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Due diligence is taking reasonable steps to avoid committing a mistake that could cause a client to suffer a financial loss. So due diligence is, in short, doing your homework and making sure that you've carried out all of the necessary that you've actually researched the sale and that you know what you're doing. The duties owed to a client are to be honest, to be loyal, to be fair, to act in good faith, and to take reasonable care. So these are just summary terms to capture the Code of Ethics as we described on the earlier slide. There's a document here which is called the RERA Broker Pledge, and this document sets out the statement that you guys as brokers accept that you are going to be carrying out your job professionally in line with laws and regulations, and that you bear legal consequence, that you accept that there's a requirement for you to do so. Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're going to briefly discuss the basic principles of law, okay? And the reason is that we're going to go into this level of detail is because Dubai is sort of a confusing place to do business because there are various courts that do different things depending on the nature of the dispute. So again, I'll put a question to you guys, and again, feel free, please, to unmute yourself and use the audio. What is the language that the courts conduct their business in Dubai?
Arabic.
Hopefully that's a fairly easy question. Arabic. So everybody says Arabic. Good. Now, next question. What is the language that most contracts are drafted in Dubai? Not all, but most. What language are most contracts drafted in? Would you guess? I mean, has anybody seen, an MOU, for example, for the sale of property? What language have you seen that typically being in? Most contracts are in English. Most of the business is conducted in English. Johanna is correct. It can sometimes be both. But if you go to the bank, for example, and you take out a loan, it's nearly always going to be in English. Any consumer contracts that you enter into are typically in English. Most engagement letters you have with many various business interests are in English. It can be both. So you have this kind of dichotomy where you have a lot of the business that is being done has been done in the English language and obviously contracted in that language for that reason. And then you have the courts which conduct their affairs in Arabic. Has anybody heard of an English language court in Dubai? Does this ring a bell? An English language court? Have anybody's heard of it? Sandeep is correct. Yeah, the Dubai International Financial Centre is an English language court. Has anybody heard the name of the court that you go to if there is a dispute between a landlord and tenant? Anybody heard of the name of that court? Where do you go if there's a landlord? Exactly. A few of you have heard of the Mohammed and Sanjay Rahul, the RDC, the Rental Dispute Centre. So already, we have a couple of things going on. We've got, Arabic language is what is used in the courts, generally speaking, for most disputes. But then you also have contracts being drafted in English. And then you also have an English language court called the Dubai International Financial Centre. And then you've got a different court called the Rental Dispute Centre when it comes to landlord-tenant disputes. And then you've got another form of dispute resolution called arbitration, which could be in English or it could be in Arabic. It's usually in English more often than not. So these are all various places that you would potentially have to go to if you have a dispute, depending on its nature, okay? So that's the reason it can be a little confusing, and this is where we're going to take a moment to hopefully unpack some of that for you, okay? So the first thing to note is that the UAE is a civil law country where the laws are written in the civil code and judges make their decisions based on the civil code. So we just had our 52nd year of independence for the UAE on the weekend gone by, okay? So 52 years ago, when the UAE became a new country, it said, well, we are going to set up a new legal system, and the legal system will include courts and include judges. And as we've already said, they decided that they were going to adopt the Arabic language. Now, nobody really creates a legal system overnight. They usually base it on an existing legal system from another country that has worked quite well. Could anybody guess? A hint is that the Arabic language is what is enshrined in the legal system here. Can anybody guess which country they looked to, the UAE looked to copy? And again, the clue being Arabic language enshrined in the UAE legal system. So you would expect it as coming from another country that has an Arabic language enshrined in its legal system. Any guesses?
Yeah. Saudi Arabia.
So the answer is Sandeep has it, Egypt. So they, pretty much copied the legal system in place in Egypt. And again, not too much of a history lesson, but in 1971, Egypt was the most populous, most economically, strong Arabic country in the League of Arabic Nations. And for that reason, it would make sense that it had a well-developed legal system, as it still does. So they copied the Arabic legal system from Egypt. It had certain features that, made sense. One, it had the custom and practice of business in place, which is familiar across the Arabic region. Secondly, it had the features of Sharia law principles reflected in their civil code. So that was something that the UAE leaders wanted to have reflected in the civil code of the UAE. As we said, it had the Arabic language in place as well. And it was, very well developed with good Islamic scholars there available to help draft this new law or these new laws for the UAE. So they based it in Egypt. And does anybody know what the Egyptian legal system is based on? Because it is based on the legal system of another European country, again, due to historical factors. The Egyptian legal system is based on the legal system of France, okay? So the civil code, sometimes referred to as the Napoleonic Code, comes from ultimately France, okay? Sometimes you trace its root back to ancient Rome, but in its more modern context, it's based in the French legal system. So it is usual enough when there is a unique dispute in the UAE that maybe hasn't really been tested here before. Sometimes lawyers will refer to how things are applied in Egypt or even in France to help in their line of argument, because they all share the same roots in the legal systems that they come from. The common law legal system comes from a completely different tradition of law, and it comes from a tradition of law from primarily English language, English-speaking countries that are formally under some sort of English rule, okay? So if I was to ask you, what would you guess based on that is the largest common law, or some of the largest common law countries in the world, which have had that, root of English law in their system. Would anybody be able to guess? Where do you think can you think of any other countries that have a legal system, common law, based on the English legal system? Well, I suppose the largest country in the world, Sanjay is correct, that has this English law legal system is India. Johanna is correct as well, saying Australia and India. So what you'll find is that the legal systems of England, Johanna says Australia, correct, India, correct, Pakistan, United States, Canada, New Zealand, Singapore, Hong Kong, Malaysia, Kenya, as Rahul says, pretty much all the Commonwealth countries and some non-Commonwealth countries like Ireland and the United States, but all of them formerly under some sort of British influence, have this common law system. And what it means is that judges are bound by the decisions that have been made by other judges in the past where there are cases with similar facts, okay? So that would mean that if you go in front of the High Court in New Delhi, the High Court judge in New Delhi is required to follow the same decision-making as the Supreme Court judge in India has done in the past. Likewise, the High Court judge in London is required to follow the same decision-making process as the Supreme Court in England. And you'll even see that the terminology is the same in India and England. They call it High Court, Supreme Court, and so on. Whereas in places like France and in the UAE, they refer to court of cassation, and they have a different, process altogether. So the key point there is that judges must follow the decisions that have been made by higher court judges in the past in these common law countries. That does not apply in the civil law countries like the UAE or France. Now, the reference or the relevance to why we're going to talk about it is because in the UAE, you have a common law jurisdiction in the financial center that Sanjeev had mentioned, which is the Dubai International Financial Center. The DIFC has its own English language common law court where it copied the laws from England and adopted them in that legal system, okay? And you or your client may come across a contract for the sale of a property or for the sale of an off-plan property or, for an MOU or anything that you want to draft. And it may actually say, if there's a dispute, go to the DIFC, which it'll all happen in English, or may, in the alternative, which is more common, require you to go onshore to the Dubai courts. So you have to be just aware that there's different courts doing different things. The UAE legal system is mainly based in civil law, as we said. The Sharia law comes into play more when it is talking about the personal affairs for Muslims, such as what do your children inherit on your death. If you're a Muslim, for example, there is heirship rules that will set out what the distribution is amongst family members. The sources of real estate law are the civil code, as we said. You also have decrees. A decree is just another word for a law, and new laws and new decrees are being introduced all of the time. And then you also have regulations, which are just types of laws to add substance to decrees. So you might have a decree that says, it's an offence to speed on the highway. And then you might have a regulation that is introduced, periodically that will increase the monetary fine for speeding. So you don't have to go back and write a new law every time you're going to say the speeding fine goes from 500 to 550 dirhams. You can do so just by introducing a regulation, for example. Okay, so I hope that's pretty straightforward. If there's any questions, ask me now, or we will continue to move on. Okay, I think that's straightforward. The Land Department system of registration services. So what we're going to talk about briefly is all of the various things that go on in the Dubai Land Department, right? And really what we're talking about here is sales and purchases. So anytime somebody's buying or selling property, okay, that would be something that is recorded in the Land Department. Mortgages. If a bank is going to lend money to somebody to go and buy a property, it's only going to do so on the basis that it has what we call security. And that really means that if the borrower fails to repay, the bank isn't going to be going, how do I get my money from him? The bank is going to be able to say, we have a mortgage over the house that he borrowed in respect of. We will take that house and we will sell it to recover what we are owed. Lease agreements, or ijari, these are your 1 year lease agreements that you have with your landlord. For example, if you're renting an apartment or if you're renting an office, say, and you register these lease agreements on the ijari system of registration. Inheritance rights. So the idea that if there are people who have rights to inherit but are not old enough, they're not yet adulthood, so that they can't take ownership in their name, they can be recorded in the land department that they are due to inherit if their parents died, for example, when they hit the right age. Restrictions on title and liens. A restriction on title is a restriction on your ability to use a particular property. So, for example, you could buy a house in Arabian Ranches, and that house is good for you for living in, so residential purposes. If you want to turn your house in Arabian Ranches into an Italian restaurant, are you allowed to do so? I mean, that's just a question to you guys. Are you allowed to take a residential house in Arabian Ranches and turn it into an Italian restaurant? Rahul says no, okay. Sandeep says no, Yegat says no, exactly, okay. Now, but on the other hand, if you are onshore in Al-Safa, Jumeirah, Sakim along Beach Road, and you're an Emirati in a neighborhood where only locals can purchase property, okay? And you want to turn, your villa on Beach Road or just off Beach Road into a diner or into a cafe, would you be entitled to do so? Any guesses? Rahul says yes. Sandeep says yes. Sanjay says yes. The answer is possibly yes. You know what I mean? It would really come down to the decision of Dubai municipality to give that permission for change of use or not. But you can already see that the restrictions of title are related to the neighborhood where you buy property, and whether it is, in a designated area where expats can purchase, or whether it's non-designated where, locals own property. But by and large, a property that you buy in a designated area where expats from anywhere in the world can purchase would have those type of restrictions in place. Liens are fines over properties that operate in the same way as mortgages. So, for example, if you fail to pay your service charges on a house or an apartment that you own, the Owners Association and the Management Committee can pursue you for non-payment, and ultimately can, through the court system, put this freezing mechanism, this lien over your property, which means that you cannot sell that property until the outstanding service charges have been paid. An easement is the right to use a property of another for a specific purpose. So if we go and buy a house in Arabian Ranches, we are entitled to enter through the security gate, where often we'll be asked for which house are we going to, but the security guard will say, well, actually, I live here, I'm going to my house. And the security guard goes, that's fine, go ahead, okay? So I have the right, an easement, to ride my car up and down that road to get to my house. However, if some person just turns up at the security gate and goes, security guard goes, where are you going? And you go, I'm really not visiting anybody. I don't know anybody here. I just want to drive and see what the place looks like. The security guard will say, no, you're not entitled to enter. Okay. So this is the idea of what rights you have over property. An easement, you can use it for a specific purpose, but you don't own it. Recording of zoning and development rights. The land department, in conjunction with various other stakeholders, such as Dubai municipality and non-designated areas, formulate ultimately the development plans for the city. So you can look at neighborhoods like Al Quoz and you will see a mixture of residential, some heavy industry, cement factories, for example, some warehousing, versus if you look at, a neighborhood such as Jumeirah, or Sakim, what you're tending to see is, low density, low rise properties for mostly only residential purposes. Of course, there is some commercial shops and restaurants within these neighborhoods to facilitate, but by and large, Sakim Jumeirah is a residential neighborhood. You don't see cement factories or industrial in there. Partial sales or public auctions. Public auctions apply or take place in situations primarily where banks foreclose, so force the sale of a property because a borrower has failed to repay its mortgage repayments, okay? So there are the scenarios where these partial sales come into place. And then finally, gifted lands are lands that are gifted from time to time by the government of Dubai to certain individuals. So, for example, Dubai police officers in the past, maybe still nowadays, have been gifted land to build, their homes, for example. So there's an example of gifted land, but there will be often, restrictions associated with land that has been gifted. So you might not be able to sell it for a period of time, or it may be in a non-designated area, so you couldn't sell it to non-locals or non-GCC nationals. Okay, so sorry, before I move on to the next slide, if there's any questions, please feel free to ask. Otherwise, I'm going to continue moving on. Okay, good. So the Land Department is the ultimate authority to register the following transactions, except for the Dubai International Financial Centre. So the DLD is involved in registering sales and purchases of property. That's the most obvious one. Oh, sorry, we've done this slide. Next slide. Services other than registration of the Land Department. Land Department is involved in the issuance of title deeds, also called certificates of title. And there is a transfer fee, a form of government tax to be paid when property is being sold. And that transfer fee is 4% of the sale price, okay? There are two situations where the transfer fee could be 8%. Now, these two situations are both very much avoidable, okay? So you're probably doing something wrong if you end up having to pay 8%, but we'll talk you through what they are. The first one is if it is an off-plan property and the seller is using a power of attorney, a POA, to resell that property. Or the second situation is if you have a completed property and the seller is using a chain of 2 powers of attorney to sell the property, where the first power of attorney holder assigns the power of attorney to the second power of attorney holder. So let's just talk this through. Let us say I own a house in Palm Jumeirah and I want to sell my house to Yigal, okay? So if I go to my friend Sanjay and I say, Sanjay, there's a sale happening next week of my house on Palm Jumeirah to Yigal. I would normally go and just turn up at the Land Department and, sell the house to Yigal, and there would be a 4% transfer fee. But unfortunately, next week I'm traveling. So Sanjay, will you take the power of attorney on my behalf, where I write the power of attorney and sign it and say that you can go and you can, act as my agent to perform the sale of the property, turn up in the Land Department because I'm away. If you do so, this Palm Jumeirah house, it's only 4% transfer fee. But if, having given the power of attorney to Sanjay to carry out this transaction, Sanjay himself, for some reason, becomes unavailable, turn up to the Land Department next week, and he assigns, so he goes and he issues a power of attorney to Sandeep. So that would be a power of attorney from me to Sanjay, from Sanjay to Sandeep, and then Sandeep ultimately concludes the sale of my house on Palm Jumeirah. Because we have this chain of 2 powers of attorney, me to Sanjay, Sanjay to Sandeep, that would demand an 8% transfer fee, okay? So it seems a bit ridiculous that this should come about, because why would I pay the extra 4%? I would just fly back myself, or if Sanjay is unavailable, I would just give a power of attorney directly to Rahul, for example. Like, there's no need for me to have this chain in place. So it shouldn't arise. And I don't need to go into the details of why this has come about, but there is some sort of logic to it. But any questions on that before I move on? If there is any confusion or questions, please ask, because we're doing good for time. Okay, all clear. Information on all mortgages recorded against the property and their priority. In some countries, more than one bank will lend against the property. In Ireland, it is normal enough, even just for a small residential property worth a few million dirhams, for two banks to lend against the same property. It's normal enough. In Dubai, you rarely ever see it, okay? So you're probably talking about something like a shopping center, where you might have more than one bank. You might have two banks. If you do have two banks lending against the property, the idea of priority is which bank has lent money first and recorded an interest first, because whoever has lent and recorded an interest first would be repaid before the other bank gets anything. Information on zoning requirements we've mentioned. Restrictive covenants are restrictions in relation to how you can use a particular property. So many properties have these obvious restrictions in place. In an apartment, for example, there is a restriction in, I'd imagine, every apartment in Dubai that says you cannot have a coal barbecue out on the balcony, because that is a fire hazard and it could burn your building down or, cause extreme hazards to your neighbors. Okay, so there is a restrictive covenant. No barbecues on the balcony, no hanging your clothing on the balcony, things of that nature. Limitations of property use. We've mentioned as well this idea that a house that you buy is for residential purposes. It's not for maybe a restaurant or other uses. Public auctions and foreclosed properties. We've mentioned the idea that banks can force the sale of property where the borrower has failed to repay on the mortgage. Escrow agents are just banks, and they are banks which perform a function which we call that of the trustee, or sometimes called the escrow agent, where monies are paid into a bank's bank account by purchasers or investors who are buying off-plan properties. So, a developer who's launching a project, selling off-plan, he has to have this escrow account with the escrow agent to collect the money from the investors. And then finally, registration trustees are simply offices licensed by the Land Department to carry out Dubai Land Department services and activities. So years ago, if you were buying property, the only place that you could go to conclude your transaction was in Deira, in the Dubai Land Department headquarters. Now there are many other licensed operators called registration trustees. You can see them in some shopping malls and various places, and they're licensed by the Land Department, and you can register jaris and you can conclude the sale of property in those offices. Okay, so any queries, guys, before we continue to move on? No, okay, good. Let's continue. Freehold ownership of properties. So freehold ownership of property is really dealing with a couple of concepts. The first thing is that in Dubai, there's a concept which is known as designated areas, where in these designated areas, anybody from anywhere in the world, all expats or locals, can buy property and they can own that property until they die. Then it goes to their family members, whoever inherits on their demise. Okay, so these designated areas are neighborhoods which have primarily been developed by these royal decrees, specially set up companies under special laws, and we refer to them as the master developers. So a question to you guys, and again, unmute or put it in the box. Please name for me some of the master developers. I'll go first, and I will say one of them is Nakheel. Any other master developers, guys, you can name? Emaar, Nakheel, Dubai Properties. I wouldn't include Danube because it hasn't been, or Azizi. Maras, yes. I wouldn't include some of those other ones because they haven't been set up under royal decree. I'm thinking of what used to be referred to as semi-government, because the likes of Soba, for example, have bought land from a, once upon a time semi-government as in Maidan, you know what I mean? But Maras, again, used to be the Highness the Engineer's Office. I would include that. So I would limit it to Nakheel, Emaar, Dubai Properties, Maras and Maidan, okay? All other big developers. Expo City is within, Sanja. I'm not too sure whose arm Expo City falls under. Does it fall under Dubai World Trade Center? Possibly does, okay? So there's one or two other ones like that for sure. I mean, Jumeirah Golf Estates used to be under Istithmar. Maritime City used to be under Dubai Ports, Customs and Free Zones. So the entire list is not just Nakheel, Emaar, but they account for probably 95% of it. I think Expo City might be under Dubai World Trade Center. So these, master developers account for, most of the land where non-GCC nationals can purchase property. So Nakheel is a good example. If you take Palm Jumeirah, the island of the Palm Jumeirah was reclaimed and developed by Nakheel, and over time, it was ultimately developed into, villas which were sold by Nakheel, shoreline apartments sold by Nakheel, but also they sold a lot of plots to what we call sub-developers. So on the Palm Jumeirah, for example, all of the crescent, that circular bit around the side where you have all the fancy hotels, all of those plots were sold to two sub-developers. So the likes of Azizi have bought a plot there and then they have developed on it, okay? But they bought the land originally from the semi-government master developer being Nakheel. If you are looking to buy property in a designated area, the rule is that anybody from anywhere in the world can buy a property there. If you are not in a designated area, such as most of Deira or most of Bur Dubai, well then only local or GCC nationals can buy property there. And GCC nationals are nationals from the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Kuwait, Oman, and Bahrain. Okay, so they are the 6 GCC national countries. If you're from one of those countries, buy property anywhere in Dubai that you want. If you're not from one of those countries, you are restricted to the designated areas. But as you can see from the map, the designated areas are very substantial, and they cover huge tracts of prime real estate. So we have, those of us who are not GCC nationals have plenty of choice to buy in those designated areas. So any questions before we move on to the next slide, guys? All good. Okay, thank you. Okay, we're going to touch on free zones and offshore companies. Okay, a free zone is a special economic zone. It permits 100% foreign ownership of registered companies, and there is zero taxation within the free zone. It's pretty clear, okay? Offshore companies are sometimes registered in the free zone in Dubai, or sometimes registered outside of Dubai, for example, when it comes to foreign countries. Now, all we really need to know here is that there are many free zones in Dubai. Like, you can name some of them: Dubai Multi-Commodity Center, JAFSA, Jebel Ali Free Zone, Dubai Media City, Dubai Knowledge Village, Dubai Academic City, Dubai International Financial Center. Now, if you want to set up in a free zone, you don't pay any corporate tax, okay? Well, taxation is changing. It used to be the rule that you'd pay zero tax, okay? So sometimes people will come to you and they will say, I want to set up a company, and its sole purpose is I want this company to own a property. There could be good tax planning, or there could be good inheritance planning, or privacy purposes, okay? So if somebody says to you that they want to buy a property, not in their own name, but through a special company or a special purpose company or a special purpose vehicle, different terms for the same thing, the response really that you can give them is that if they say, I want to use my existing Cayman Island company or my company registered in England or whichever country they may say, you have to tell them that they can't use a foreign company to own property in Dubai. It must be a Dubai registered company. And the option really is the Jebel Ali Free Zone Authority, the JAFSA offshore company. So this JAFSA offshore company, it doesn't have an office. It doesn't have, any physical assets. It doesn't have any visas for employees. It's just a company that you set up, and that company is entitled to be the owner of property, and it's entitled to open a bank account, and you could have the company rent the property out and collect rental income if that's what your plan is. Okay, so that's the concept of the issuance of title to offshore companies. You can't use a foreign company. It's got to be a Dubai registered free zone company, which really limits you to the JAFSA offshore company. Good. The interim real estate register, or the OCUD, okay? So this is a special register for registering the off-plan properties in Dubai. So in the same reason, Yigal, which free zone can do it? Going back, it is the Jebel Ali Free Zone, Yigal. Does that make sense? The Jebel Ali Free Zone.
Only Jebel Ali Free Zone?
Yeah, so at the moment, you see, it's up to each free zone to decide if it is going to put in regulations to set up these offshore type companies. And to my knowledge, only JAFSA has chosen to do so. Yeah, so for example, Media City don't have a Media City offshore company. The only one that I'm aware of is the Jebel Ali Free Zone offshore.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Just Joseph, if I could just add one more point in this. With my experience, what we have seen is even though we may use the offshore company, the Dubai Land Department eventually and ultimately asks for who are the UBOs.
Yes, yeah. And I mean, they need to ask who are the UBOs because the Land Department needs to make sure that, criminals ultimately are not sitting behind all of these companies, or money laundering or whatever the case may be. So that's not really a point that we go into, but there is a requirement on JAFSA, for example, not just the Land Department. JAFSA itself is required to inform the relevant authorities of the UBOs, so that if you have a JAFSA company, you're required to make a submission to them about who the UBOs are, and if you're, not being truthful, there's consequences. Okay.
Joseph, sorry.
Sorry, Sanjay. UBO means ultimate beneficial owner. Okay. So the idea, Sanjay, is that if I set up a Jebel Ali Free Zone company and I call it Blue Pen Limited, I can't suddenly have Blue Pen Limited being owned by another JAFSA company called Red Pencil Limited. I mean, we have to be able to know exactly who the actual human being is that ultimately owns it. That's called the ultimate beneficial owner. Sorry, was there one more question there?
Yes, just want to make sure that I understood correct. Can you go back to the previous slide?
Yes.
So, if I understood correct, any offshore company registered in Dubai Free Zone can hold, can have properties under its name. But the Jebel Ali Free Zone is for offshore companies that are owned by a foreign company.
No, sorry, no, not necessarily. No. So the point here is that any offshore company registered in a Dubai Free Zone may register title. Okay. However, these free zones, such as Media City and Academic City and Knowledge Village, they don't have offshore companies within their operations. They just don't. They've never set that side of business up. So from a practical perspective, by a matter of elimination, the only free zone that is actually establishing offshore companies is the Jebel Ali Free Zone. So if somebody comes to you and says, I want to buy a house, okay, and I want to be owned by a Dubai company, can I use a Media City offshore company? The response is, I don't believe Media City have an offshore company, but JAFSA do.
So Jebel
Is that-
Ali will have it. Jebel Ali
Yeah,
will have offshore company for sure.
Exactly. Yeah.
But Joseph, the Dubai Media City Free Zone Company can still buy the property in Dubai.
The Dubai Media Free Zone, but from a practical perspective, if you were to set up a Dubai Media Free Zone company, okay, that could have a renewal of 50,000 dirhams per year, okay, and for that to have the sole purpose of owning a property, that would be a very uneconomic way to conduct your business.
Yeah.
Why would you do that? Like, you're going to set up what we call an SPV. These other free zones don't have SPV structures ultimately, So I don't know of anybody turning up and going, I want to buy a property through a Media City company. I mean, but I'd imagine the land department would accept it. I don't know how often they would get that request though.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks, Sandeep. Okay, so registration in the interim register. Every contract or SPA for the sale or transfer of an off-plan property must be recorded in the interim register, the ACUD. It is the developer's responsibility to register. Contracts for the sale of properties and projects not approved by the land department are void. When the developer obtains the certificate of completion for the project, the transfer of title must be registered in the real estate register at the land department. Okay, so the idea here being that the land department need to know even those contracts which are, for properties that are under construction. The land department doesn't expect tens of thousands of investors to be coming to its headquarters going, where do I register my off-plan purchase? It wants the developer to go to the relevant desk and to register these in an organized fashion. The next point is that, if there is a property that's been sold and that project is not approved by the land department, it is void. That means that it's not a lawful sale in the first place. So you should never find yourself in a situation where you have assisted in selling something that cannot be sold, okay? Because it's not got the proper legal rights for sale. Okay, so what we're going to do then is we're going to take a quick break, guys, okay? We're ahead of schedule, so we will come back at 5:40, okay? So we'll take a little over a half an hour, and we'll have a cup of tea, okay? Okay, we'll see you in a little over half an hour.